So tonight's program, I'm very excited to be with all of you for our weekly program this week on the French and Indian War. I'm Andrew Dalton, the Executive Director of the Adams County Historical Society in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We are the community archives and research entity that's probably used most in Gettysburg for any kind of research topic. If you're researching genealogy or property history or the Battle of Gettysburg, people come and see us, and we love playing that part in the community. If you're enjoying the video, I hope you'll hit the donate button tonight and support our work in preserving all this incredible history. In our collection, we have over 1 million historic items, and we always need help to make sure that they're carefully preserved. So thank you for that, and check out our website as well if you have a chance, and like our Facebook page. We just actually today learned that we're the most followed page of all the county historical societies in the state of Pennsylvania. So we're really thankful for all of you for helping us and supporting us. And we'll keep doing these programs as long as we can, and until Tim's repertoire is exhausted, if that ever happens. But tonight we're going to be talking about the French and Indian War. A really great topic. Of course, these early topics are very popular, and actually we had more people sign up for this event tonight than any Facebook event we've done so far. So I'm really glad to see that there's interest for these earlier topics as well, and we're going to try to bring you even more diverse topics in terms of other eras of history, and including World War I and World War II, which we have coming up here in the next few weeks. So tonight, though, we're going to be talking about the French and Indian War, early settlement, and some of the really famous incidents that took place here in what would become Adams County, kidnappings of the families of Mary Jameson, Richard Bard, and a few others. And Tim is going to talk about that, as well as the larger context of what was going on in southern Pennsylvania, or what would become Adams County during the 1750s and even earlier. So we will get into the program here, and I'll turn things over to Tim Smith, my colleague, who's the historian and collections manager of the Adams County Historical Society. Tim?
Well, thanks for joining us. And, you know, the French and Indian War hit at a critical time in the early development of what would become Adams County. And of course, it affected the people who were the early settlers that lived in our area. Let's go to the next one. You know, I think we should mention that as people wander around the county, peruse the fields of Adams County over the years, there have been a great amount of artifacts discovered relating to early Native Americans. And the collections at the Adams County Historical Society are just filled with arrowheads and stones that were used in some form or fashion. Let's go to the next one. Just a sampling of the arrowheads in one of our cases and spear points, give you an idea of what we're talking about. But a lot of these artifacts that we find in our area aren't necessarily related to the early period of European settlement. Native American peoples occupied this area for some 10,000 years prior to the European settlements. Let's go to the next one. There's an excellent exhibit at the Pennsylvania State Museum on early life of the peoples that occupied the area prior to Europeans. And it's well worth, if you get the opportunity, going through the State Museum and seeing this exhibit. Also, let's go to the next one. There's a book, Indians in Pennsylvania. And this book by Paul Wallace, written many years ago, kind of describes the area and what we know about the prehistory of the area and what we know about the tribes that occupied this area just prior to European settlement. You might know, let's go to the next one, that the Susquehannocks were in this area. And John Smith, you know, of Williamsburg, actually drew a map of the Chesapeake Bay showing the Susquehanna River. And as part of the map, he actually, there was an engraving of one of the Susquehannock members of the Susquehannock tribe, and you can see it here in this illustration. Of course, there's been paintings done by various artists based upon the sketches that John Smith made of these early people. But by the time that European settlers really hit the area that we're in, most of the Native Americans had moved farther westward. And we don't really have many descriptions or accounts of interactions between the early settlers here and the Native Americans that occupied this area. Of course, in 1681, William Penn received a grant for 45,000 square acres of land from Charles II of England. Of course, he named it Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods. And, you know, there were several reasons that he wanted to pursue this piece of land, but one of them was to create a haven for, fellow Quakers that had been subjected to religious persecution in England, as well as other groups of people that had been persecuted for their religious beliefs in England. He referred to Pennsylvania as the Holy Experiment. You know, Penn died in 1718, really before there were any settlers in this area. But the lands continued to be administered by his wife and his sons. And one of the funny things you hear all the time is people will say, "I have a deed from William Penn to my property," but no one that lives here in Adams County can claim a deed to William Penn because he was dead before these deeds were done. But some people, I've seen a bunch of deeds that people have that were signed by the agent of William Penn's sons or grandsons, and they were the one who were administering the early records, the land in this area. Let's go to the next one.
Right, and I wanted to point out too, of these early paper records, we actually, even though Adams County wasn't formed until 1800, in our collections we have deeds and other land-related documents dating back to the 1730s. So it is really amazing to see some of these documents and learn more about the process of how these early settlers were getting their land.
And I wanted to mention that this was originally part of Chester County in 1682. And then in 1729, Lancaster County was founded, and we were technically part of Lancaster County. And then in 1749, York County was established out of the western townships of Lancaster County, and we were York County. And of course, in 1800, the western townships of York County became Adams County. But while it was still Chester County, we had our first documented settler, and that's John Hanson Steelman, or Hans Steelman. He was born in Philadelphia in 1655. He died in 1749 at 94 years of age. He may have been a settler in this area in southwestern Adams County as early as 1718, around the time of William Penn's death. He actually had a trading post there. In 1924, one of our prominent local historians that became a national historian was Albert Cook Myers, and he was largely responsible for having a marker placed near the site of the trading post of Hans Steelman. We know that Steelman was issued a warrant for 200 acres of land from the authorities in Maryland in 1740. And this marker is pretty close to the land that was, given early to Hans Steelman. I should mention that this marker placed in 1924 was later struck by an automobile, and it was replaced in 1977 by the marker on the right. So they actually replaced the plaque on the marker, although the stone is the same. And it is at the intersection of, I think it's Petcher Road, Crum Road, Topper Road, and Steelman Marker Road. A bunch of roads, it's an intersection, four-way intersection comes together there at that location. It's not far from the present day Zora. I should also mention, and I'm very excited about this, the girl in the photograph there is Nancy Keith. And recently we received a donation from the Keith actually the Johnson family that's related to the Keith family, and in it were a whole bunch of materials relating to the dedication of this monument, including an original program and 5 or 6 photographs that were taken that day of Nancy Keith. And her father was a lawyer in Gettysburg, I believe studied under David Wills, and was one of the keynote speakers there that day. The Native American in the view there, his name is Chief Strong Wolf, I believe, and he just happened to be touring this part of the country at the same time the monument was dedicated, speaking to various groups of Boy Scouts, and he showed up and attended the ceremony. It's interesting that Nancy Keith in the photograph in 1924 was also present at the rededication in 1977 of the Steelman marker when the new plaque was put on. So we have lots of information about this early trading post. Now, I should just mention that Hans Steelman was a settler from Maryland that came up into this area. Let's go to the next one. William Penn and his relatives were always getting permission to settle land, or always trying to negotiate for the settlers to move into a tract of land with whatever authority was said to be the administrator of that piece of land. And this policy of peaceful negotiations with the Native Americans in this area basically kept Pennsylvania out of war and free of a lot of the massacres and raids that had occurred in Virginia and Maryland and New York at the same period. So it was a very good policy. Now, one could argue today that perhaps the Native Americans that were signing over title to their land did not exactly understand the specifications of everything that was involved, or maybe weren't aware of the ownership of property as the European settlers were. But this policy really kept this area free of raids until this French and Indian War we're going to talk about. Let's go to the next one. Oh, does it change it? Maybe Andrew froze there for a moment. Now we have several early settlements in this area during this time period. And the Pennsylvania settlers, of course, came into this area in the 1730s and the 1740s. And the Marsh Creek settlement focused around the area that we're in today. The Scotch-Irish Presbyterians formed the Marsh Creek settlement. Of course, the southeastern part of the county in the 1730s and 40s was predominantly German. The Scotch-Irish Presbyterian were very fiery people. They had immigrated to this area from Northern Ireland. Of course, they're originally from Scotland, but they were resettled by some of the English authorities, and they suffered from religious persecution. That was the Great Conewaga Presbyterian Church. And of course, we had the Lower Marsh Creek Presbyterian Church and the Upper Marsh Creek Presbyterian Church, as shown in this image. And many of the early families that settled this area were part of this Scotch-Irish Presbyterian group that immigrated here. Some of these people would eventually move to Western PA and then Ohio, and some would move down through Virginia into North Carolina. So a lot of the people we're talking about actually were only in this area for a short amount of time before they ended up moving elsewhere. And we have a lot of people that come to the Historical Society to do research that are interested in these early families. One story that I always like to tell, and I'm sure that many of the people in the program have heard me tell this before, but if you look at a lot of the early tombstones of these Scotch-Irish settlers, you'll see the red hand of Ulster on the tombstone. And it's sort of an Irish folklore that kind of, or a myth that goes along with the grave, but is symbolic to the Scotch Irish. And basically, there were two warring families in Northern Ireland, and they had trouble settling their differences. So they decided to have a series of contests to decide which family would gain possession of a piece of land that they were both squabbling over. And each family got together. Each family got their strongest and their most intelligent representative, and they vied in a series of contests. And going into the last contest, the two family representatives were tied. So whoever won the last contest would be deemed, that family would take possession of the land. And basically, and again, this is a folklore, so I should preface it by saying it is not true. But in some of the stories, they are rowing across a pond or a lake. And I think in one of the stories, they say they're rowing across part of the North Sea. But basically, it's a contest of rowing, and whichever representative touches land first would be deemed the winner. So the one representative of the one family, and some of the versions, they give the names of the family, was much stronger than the other one, and he was going to win, and he was way ahead of the other guy. But the guy that was going to lose knew that he could not let his family down. So he pulled out his sword, he chopped off his hand, and he threw it on shore ahead of the other guy, and he won the contest. So he sacrificed his hand for his family and for his country. And it's kind of a symbolic story that the Scotch Irish are willing to lay down their lives for their countrymen. So that's the Red Hand of Ulster. And, you know, we challenge you to go out to the various cemeteries around Adams County and see if you can locate tombstones with the Red Hand of Ulster on it. And if you look at the tombstone, a lot of them you'll notice actually not just have the hand, but it's severed and blood is squirting out of the veins of the hand. That's the ones I like the best. Also, I should mention that the early settlers here were also from Maryland. We had several claims to our land by Marylanders. We had Diggs Choice, Carrollsburg, Carroll's Delight, and these are Marylanders moving into this area. And of course, there was a dispute early on as to whether this area would be part of Maryland or part of Pennsylvania. It really was a dispute over the way the Calvert family of Maryland and the Penn family of Pennsylvania, the way that the deeds, or I should say the land grants from the kings of England were worded. And of course, Maryland got their land grant some 60 years before William Penn. But in 1739, they came up with a temporary agreement as to where the line would be between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And, you know, when they came up with the temporary agreement, Pennsylvania agreed to allow the Maryland settlers to still retain the land that they had purchased from the authorities of Maryland. So we had some Marylanders also that were settled in this area at the time. But tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the French and Indian War, which is from basically 1754 to 1763. And this war is really a power struggle between the English, who had settled the eastern seaboard of the United States, and the French, who controlled the Mississippi River Valley northward into the Great Lakes and into Canada. And of course, Native Americans were located sort of in the buffer zone between the English settlers and the French settlers. In previous conflicts between the French and the English, the Native Americans seemed to maintain somewhat of a neutral stance. But the French were able to convince the Native Americans, especially in the Ohio River Valley, that the European settlers posed a threat as they moved westward into their lands. Basically, the whole thing started with George Washington in 1753. And the governor of Virginia in Williamsburg asked George Washington to go out to the Ohio River Valley, where French soldiers were starting to build forts, and to explain to them that this area was part of Virginia and they should cease and halt the building of forts. The French had a grand plan that they could connect the Ohio River Valley to the Great Lakes area and then down the Mississippi towards their strongholds near Louisiana and connect their frontier by this chain of forts. So George Washington basically went out, talked to some of the French soldiers in what is now Western Pennsylvania, and they kind of laughed and told him that they weren't going to cease and desist. He went back to Virginia. He talked to the governor, and they decided that they would send a force of Virginians out to the forks of the Ohio and out to present-day Pittsburgh, to the to the near the forks of the Monongahel and the Allegheny in Ohio, and they would build a fort. They got there, they started building the fort. The French learned of their presence, came down, evicted the British. The governor of Virginia sent a larger force out under George Washington to try to, build the fort. When George Washington got close, he realized that the French were in force there. At some point, it was learned that a part of the French force was camped in a glen not far from his camp. And, there's some debate over the exact details of what happened. But at a place today we called Granville Glen, George Washington attacked and killed a few of the Frenchmen, including the brother of the commander at near the fort in Pittsburgh, what the French had named Fort Duquesne. George Washington realized after that short battle that he was going to be attacked by the French force. So he fell back, and at a place called Great Meadows, he built a fort out of necessity. On July 3rd, 1754, he was attacked. After a short battle, he was forced to surrender at Fort Necessity. And George Washington basically took his force after they were let go and marched back to near Williamsburg, Virginia. But in the meantime, the British government decided to send a expeditionary force of British soldiers over to assist the colonists. And in 1755, a force under the command of General Edward Braddock, along with the Virginia militia of George Washington, marched back out across Virginia and through Maryland into what is now Pennsylvania to once again attack the French stronghold at Fort Duquesne. On July 9th, 1755, at a place called Monongahel, it was the Battle of Monongahel, the British forces and the Virginia militia were overwhelmed. Edward Braddock was mortally wounded in the fight, and George Washington once again had to retire with his force back towards Virginia. This battle of the Monongahel, in which men from this area were also involved, and there's some records that indicate that some of our local citizens here were also part of that force that marched westward. This battle just blew open the frontier. And because of this, there were immediate fears that this area would be raided by forces from French and Indians or their Native American allies. And the expected raids into our area started in the fall of 1755. We have several letters written by a Reverend Thomas Barton, an Episcopal minister that was part of, he actually administered, he was an Anglican minister who actually served some of the people in this area who were early settlers. And in one letter he wrote, "The complicated distress of these poor creatures are beyond expression. What few inhabitants remain in Cumberland are daily flying from thence, so that in 3 or 4 days it will be totally relinquished. Marsh Creek is now the frontier, and such a panic has seized the hearts of the people in general, that unless we have soon some favorable turn in our affairs, I am afraid the enemy need not long be at pains to dispute a claim of those 2 counties." In other words, the place that was once inhabited by a serious amount of settlers, people are fleeing. On October 16th, 1756, there was the Penn Creeks Massacre. And basically, Shawnee and Delaware Indians raided the frontier. At the Penn Creeks Massacre, 14 people were killed, 11 were captured. At a place called Great Cove in what is now Franklin County, from October 31st to November 2nd, 100 Delaware and Shawnee Indians, the Delawares under the command of Shingus the Terrible, fell upon the settlements, and in a series of battles or raids, 57 people were killed or captured, and the survivors fled eastward. According to Thomas Barton, let's see, "I had just come from Carlisle. You may see by the enclosed what a situation I left it. The Great Cove is entirely reduced to ashes. I suppose by tomorrow there will not be one woman or child in the town of Carlisle. Mr. Hamilton marches this morning with a party of 60 men from Carlisle to Shippenstown. Mr. Pope and Mr. McConaughey came over with me to raise reinforcements in order to join Mr. Hamilton immediately. I intend this morning to return to Carlisle with a party of men to guard that town." And it was a serious problem on the frontier. One of the basic issues is that the Pennsylvania Commonwealth, the government of this area, was controlled largely by the Quakers of Pennsylvania, as it had by the early settlement of the state. And the Quakers did not believe in funding militia or building forts. And so when the British fell back towards the East Coast, and the British, whatever defense of the area was here by the British, they fell all the way back, and there were no defenses west of Philadelphia. And so the raiding parties basically had their own way in this area. One outcome of the French and Indian War would be that the Quakers would lose their power in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because of this. By 1756, people started to pass bills to provide money for the building of forts along the frontier and for the establishment of strong militia units that could be used to defend this area. Writing from Huntington Township, the Reverend Barton wrote, "I was obliged more than once to call together the inhabitants to meet in a body at my house in order to encourage them under their present fearful apprehensions. What a poor, defenseless situation this is. Not a man in 10 is able to purchase a gun. Not a house in 20 has a door with either a lock or bolt to it, so that a very small number of Indians might totally destroy the whole inhabitants without the least opposition." I think that we tend to look back at, the early settlement years today, and we think of the Daniel Boone, and we think that everybody has a rifle and that everybody has the ability to defend themselves. But, not 1 in 20 has a rifle, or 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 a door with a lock on it, according to that letter. And it wasn't an easy task to gather troops together to defend this area. Now, Barton mentions in the one letter Hans Hamilton, and Hans Hamilton is quite a local leader during the French and Indian War. He's probably the most famous person from Adams County to be involved in the French and Indian War. In 1756, he was actually given command, or maybe late 1755, of Fort Littleton, which is one of the forts that was constructed. And Fort Littleton is still a stop along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the Fort Littleton exit. And if you've never done it, you get off of that exit and you go not too far and you come to the site of Fort Littleton, which is actually marked by a historical Pennsylvania marker. He was born, of course, in Ireland in 1721. He died in 1772. He owned a large amount of land in this area, including a tract of land in what is now Butler Township. He was the first sheriff of York County in 1749. And as I mentioned, in 1756, he was commissioned as a captain in charge of Fort Littleton. And he participated in raids and forays against the enemy. In 1758, he'd be a lieutenant colonel of the 1st Battalion of Pennsylvania Regiment afoot during the Forbes expedition. A quote from the 1886 history of Adams County: "The well-known name of Colonel Hans Hamilton is inseparably connected with the early history of York and Adams County. He was the Napoleon of immigrants who settled the country immediately west of the Susquehanna. He was a born leader of men with a genius that founds empires, organizes states, and wields boundless control over great communities." And what's interesting today is Hamilton actually has a stone in Evergreen Cemetery. So he's buried in Evergreen, we believe, today. Now, obviously, he was buried in another cemetery somewhere else, probably Upper Marsh Creek Cemetery on Belmont Road. And at some later point, his body was removed into our Evergreen Cemetery. In 1757, okay, Andrew's back. Removed into our Evergreen Cemetery. In 1757, you're a few seconds behind me.
Go ahead, Tim. Let's get
okay. So
get back to where you were.
In 1756, there were a couple raids into our area, into the area. There was on April 1st, 1756, there was a raid at Fort McCord, and not far from present-day Edenville. One more, okay, there you go. Not far from Edenville in present-day Franklin County. And in that raid, 27 settlers were killed or taken prisoner. And this was actually a blockhouse that had been built by the settlers. So the settlers were really aware of the fact that raiding parties would come in at night or early in the morning. And so during the day, they felt free to go out to their farms and take care of their crops. But in the evening, they came all together into these blockhouses. And in the early morning hours of April 1st, this blockhouse was attacked. A group of settlers set off from Shippensburg after this group of raiders and actually caught up with them as somewhere along Sidlings Hill, where we had the Battle of Sidlings Hill, and several of the raiders, the militia, and several of the raiders were killed. So there was actually a battle after this. And afterwards, they ended up at Fort Littleton, the whole party, where, of course, Hans Hamilton was. So we have a nice account of that. Also, in September of 1756, there was August 2nd, 1756, was the battle at Fort Granville near present-day Lewistown. And in that battle, the fort surrendered, but the Native Americans still killed the commander of the fort, a guy named Armstrong. His brother, who would be Colonel John Armstrong, immediately decided to take matters into his own hands. Let's go to the next slide. And I would say, when you read about this, one of, the most badass moves that I've ever read about, he gathers together 300 settlers and they travel across Pennsylvania and they actually attack the Native American village at Katanning. See, these raids were not being, done by Native Americans who lived in our area. They lived out in the Ohio River Valley, out near present-day Pittsburgh, and they were raiding over the mountains in war parties and hitting the settlements. So Armstrong took a group, went over the mountains and attacked their village. He actually ended up losing more men than he actually killed in the battle at Katanning, but it sent a message to the raiding parties that, hey, we can do the same thing to you that you're doing to our families along the frontier. And, I think it's debated today whether this raid was a good thing or if it just increased then the attacks on the settlements by the Delaware and the Shawnee and their French allies. Because in 1758, we had the two most famous incidents associated with the French and Indian War that occurred in our area. And on April 5th, 1758, the home of Thomas Jameson in Buchanan Valley was raided, present-day Buchanan Valley. According to his daughter, Mary, 6 Shawnee Indians and 4 Frenchmen. It's important to note that French soldiers are leading these raids. 4 Frenchmen attacked the farm, killing 1 man and taking 10 prisoners. 2 of her brothers hid in the barn and managed to escape. A man named Fields led a party of settlers in pursuit of the party and soon were hot on their trail. To avoid capture, the Shawnee and French murdered all but 2 of the party. Mary Jamison was taken to Fort Duquesne and given to 2 Seneca women. She spent several years in the Ohio River Valley, and eventually she was taken to a village near present-day Geneseo, New York. Twice married to Indian men, she mothered 8 children and never took advantage of the opportunities to escape. In time, she acquired a large tract of land along the Geneseo River. She died in 1833, 90 years of age. In 1907, Letchworth State Park was established in Livingston County, New York, and a statue of Mary Jamison was dedicated there in 1910. Let's go to the next one. Here's a statue of Mary Jamison on the left at Letchworth State Park. And of course, I believe off the top of my head, 1921, 1922, a statue was dedicated at St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church in Buchanan Valley, also to Mary Jamison. And it said that the stones at the bottom of the statue are actually stones from the foundation of the Jamison house. Although today we debate about the exact location of the house that was raided. Let's go to the next one. In 1823, Mary Jamison was interviewed. And in 1824, a book was published on the life of Mary Jamison. It's interesting that in the book, she thought that she was taken prisoner in 1855, when in actuality it was 1858. And we have a good newspaper article. Let's go to the next slide. We have a newspaper article from April 13th, 1758, that talks in the Pennsylvania Gazette, that actually talks about the raid on the Jameson farm. A boy that was the daughter, I guess he was the son of a lady whose husband was in the army that came to live with the Jamesons, was also taken, a guy named Mann, and John Mann. And he actually was also kept with Mary Jamison until they got to Pittsburgh. In the book, in her 1823 interview, she mentions John Mann, but she doesn't know what happens to him after that. And what's interesting is his name does appear on a list from June 1761 of captives that were returned to the state of Pennsylvania. And it actually says that one of the children, John Mann of Marsh Creek, Pennsylvania, was taken in 1758. So he actually was returned to his family. And we don't know much more about him, but that's just fascinating to me. Another article that's in the Pennsylvania Gazette, let's go, oh, here it is, a short time later, discusses another raid, and that's the raid on Bard's Mill. I'll read this passage about the raid from Dr. Charles Gladfelter, of course, the former director of the Adams County Historical Society, now deceased, but he had written a lot about the subject of early settlement and about these raids. Oh, I should mention that Dr. Gladfelter actually did an article on Mary Jamison. It appears in the Adams County History Journal, #2. And if you want to learn more about this, you can read this journal. They discuss the Jamison raid and the Bard raid in great detail. And he says, on Thursday, April 13th, 1758, some 19 Delaware Indians descended upon the frontier mill of Richard Bard. It was located at present-day Virginia Mills, northwest of Fairfield in Hamilton Bond Township. The all too usual sequel was repeated here: pillage, burning, torture, and murder. Of the 9 persons who were in or near the house at the time, 4 were killed as they fled westward, including the Bard's 6-month-old baby. 3 young people who were not their children were eventually liberated. Richard Bard, who was then 22 years old, escaped from his captors and then spent most of the next 2.5 years searching for his wife. In September 1760, he found her near Sunbury and paid 40 pounds to gain her release. During her long captivity, she had traveled about 500 miles on foot, first west to Fort Duquesne and then east to the upper Susquehanna Valley. Once freed and reunited, Richard and Catherine Bard spent the rest of their lives in Franklin County, where they had at least 4 more children. Their graves are near Mercersburg. And the Bard story is just incredible. We're fortunate that Richard Bard actually escaped, and he signed an affidavit on May 12th, 1758. He gave his affidavit about the attack and the captivity before he escaped. And it is fascinating to read. And it is in Dr. Gladfelter's article on Mary Jamison. Let's go to the next one. We're also fortunate, I think it was in 1908, that the Bards decided to publish a family history. And of course, part of their story is, that their great grandfather was involved in this raid. And had he not escaped and had not managed to find his wife, then this whole family would not exist. But they survived, they had children, they had grandchildren. And in 1908, a member of the family hired local photographer William Tipton, and they went out to Bard's Mill, which is in present-day Virginia Mills, and took photographs of what was then the mill and the house that still stood where this raid occurred. And here is a photograph from the Adams County Historical Society. We have, fortunately, we have really nice versions of the photographs that were included in the book. And this is Bard's Mill, which today is just a foundation. And on the right of that previous photograph, you can see this structure, and that's the Bard House itself, which of course is on Mount Hope Road, near, not far, just west of Virginia Mills. And so it's fascinating to visit. You can visit the exact site of this house. Let's go to the next one. So after this raid, soldiers from this area are organized as a part of a force of Pennsylvania soldiers to put an end to this war. The British government, under, I believe it's William Pitt, decided to take a more aggressive approach to this conflict in Pennsylvania. In 1756, this conflict between the English and the French just evolved into a world war. We call it the 7 Years' War, but 1756 to 1763. But there was fighting in Europe, there was fighting in North America, there was fighting in India, there was fighting all around the globe. And I think a lot of people would argue this is the first world conflict. And in this, they sent General Forbes to the United States, and General Forbes organized a group of Virginians and Pennsylvanians and British soldiers, and they decided to start at Carlisle and move to Shippensburg and Fort Loudon, and then of course up to Fort Littleton. And then they moved across a road that they built as they went along towards the French-held Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Monongahel and the Allegheny. And in this unit, there were Adams Countyans. There were 4 companies that today, when we look at the rosters, we kind of identify as Adams Countyans. They were commanded by Captain David Hunter, of course, of Hunterstown, Robert McPherson, a good local name, Archibald McGrew, and Thomas Hamilton, Hans Hamilton's son. And Hans Hamilton was the lieutenant colonel of this unit. They basically marched across Pennsylvania and evicted the French soldiers from Fort Duquesne, which of course then was named Fort Pitt. And it would be, you know, it would evolve into the modern day Pittsburgh. So there were a bunch of men from this area that served in that unit that marched across the state of Pennsylvania. We do not have rosters of the soldiers that were in these units. We only have a list of officers of the various companies. We would love to see the names of the individual soldiers that were involved in these actions that we just described during the French and Indian War. We simply don't have them. But these Scotch-Irish settlers that had moved, or their families before them had moved here because of persecution by the English, and then the families, Scotch-Irish, living on the frontier from 1755 until 1758, when the British finally decided to send troops, you know, to actually do something about these raiding parties. They lived here for a few years in constant fear and threat of raid. They knew people that were killed. They feared for their family safety. A few years later, when war is declared on the English, you would have no problem raising troops from this area of Pennsylvania to fight against the British. And today, our early cemeteries are filled with American Revolutionary War soldiers. And let's go to the next one. As an example, Lower Marsh Creek Presbyterian Cemetery, which of course is a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian cemetery in Adams County. You can see the plaque with the names of some of these men that served in the American Revolution. We do have rosters and information on the American Revolutionary soldiers, but undoubtedly many of these same individuals or their parents fought in the French and Indian War against the English, or I'm saying against the French and their Native American allies. I think that's the end of our program. Oh, you're on mute.
We're having a lot of technical problems tonight, aren't we? But a dead router at my house, and I took a quick trip back here so that you could get the last few slides for your dramatic ending there. But thank you everybody for watching tonight. We're gonna sort out our internet issues for next week so that we don't have as many problems, but thanks for bearing with us, and I'm really pleased to see that so many people are interested in these great early topics, the French and Indian War, early settlement. We're really working hard to do more with that locally, and we have some big plans for a new facility in the Gettysburg area that we'll be sharing with you probably by the end of the year or early January. So stay tuned for that. Please like our page, and if you liked the video tonight, please consider hitting the donate button at the bottom. Even a few dollars go a long way to help us preserve all these incredible records in our care, some of which Tim showed you tonight, and photographs as well. So we're excited.
Andrew,
Yeah.
could we go back to that one where we're going to show that one of the documents that we do have from the French and Indian War?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Let me get it here. Yeah, this is actually, this is something that Tim brought to my attention today, which we would really want to place in an exhibit in the future. Go ahead, Tim.
Now, this document right here is from our David McConaughey papers. David McConaughey was a local lawyer who in the 1850s, and possibly some in the 1840s, was helping Revolutionary War veterans and War of 1812 veterans receive pensions for their War of 1812 Revolutionary War service. Now, this is a widow. So you can see at the very bottom, the widow was married in the year 1805. So this is an older guy who married a younger girl, and then she's now an older widow, and she's collecting a pension on her husband's service. And he did serve in the Revolutionary War, but at the very beginning of it, it mentions that John Galbraith was only enlisted one time, and that was at Byers on Conewaga Creek, now Bell's Mill. That's Table Rock. So that's Table Rock he's talking about. And for a term of 3 years in the French and Indian War, the time that Pittsburgh was taken, his officers were Hans Hamilton, the colonel of the regiment, and President Washington was his major. So he's pointing out his association with George Washington, who was with that force of soldiers that marched on Fort Duquesne. Of course, Washington controls the Virginia militia, and Hans Hamilton is in the lieutenant colonel of the Pennsylvania militia. So I find it fascinating, though, that we have that one document that we know that that guy joined a company at what he calls Biggers, not Biglerville, has nothing to do with Biglerville. Biggers is a mill at Table Rock in the 1750s.
Right. Yeah, and it is so interesting to me too that we do have local residents even decades before Adams County was formed that are serving in the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, when Adams County was a part of York County or even earlier. So these are really interesting early topics that we really enjoy. I also think we talk a lot about the civilians in the Battle of Gettysburg and their experiences of fear and terror, and in some cases physical harm, with the many civilians being wounded. But we don't talk a lot about the civilians that were here living on the frontier in Pennsylvania in the 1750s, these kidnapping incidents like the Bards and the Jamisons. And really the history kind of repeated itself, I think. And Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, at least the Bard family, I believe, just descendants of these families are still living here during the battle. And you know, their descendants face kind of the same thing over again in a different way, having their own yards, you know, backyards turned into a war zone. So we love the depth to Gettysburg and Adams County's history, and the fact that we can find these amazing stories that are really nationally significant, all the way back to the French and Indian War period. That's why we're so fortunate to work here and do this. And we think that Adams County really has one of the best stories, if not the best story of any community in the country. And we're excited to do more to bring that story to you and explore all these various eras of history that don't get quite as much airtime. So thanks for being with us again tonight. And thanks for all your donations and comments and likes. We so appreciate it. And thanks for making us the #1 Facebook page and for historical societies in the state of Pennsylvania. We're really proud of that. And Tim and I have been watching carefully as we moved up in the rankings over the past year. So thank you all for your support. And we're going to be with you, I believe, next Thursday evening and Thursdays afterwards. It seems like a good time for everybody. And we really enjoy doing these programs. So thank you for your support. I hope everyone is well and safe and healthy. And thanks for supporting Adams County history. Have a good night, everybody.